Welcome to everybody. We have a nice group here online joining us on Zoom. And those of you who are on Zoom, you should just know if we were to zoom out the camera here in the auditorium at the Forest at Duke, you would see a nice group of 30 or so people gathered enjoying lunch. I'm going to ask you, if you're on Zoom, as you all are now, to please stay on mute. And if you have a question, then we'll let you know and have you come off of mute. Introduce myself. I'm Rabbi Daniel Graber, and I want to say a huge thank you to Donna Goldstein. Everybody give it a round of applause to Donna. She is our official Beth El Synagogue liaison for the Rabbis Lunches and Learn, like attorneys general, Lunches and Learn this year. And we will be, I think we're going to try and do this once a month. It'll be delightful to learn together throughout the course of the year. If there are topics that you would like for the rabbi to try and address at a Lunch and Learn, please feel free to let Donna know, and she will relay those on. In the absence of that, you will have to trust that my taste is okay, and I will try to bring things that I think are of interest and related to the Jewish tradition. And it's wonderful to have a group of people on Zoom as well. And this way we'll sort of continue to be able to do this format. Although I do just want to remind you, if you are here in Durham, from my mom, she will be coming to Durham to visit for a little bit. I'm not sure if her visit will overlap with the Lunch and Learn, but if you're in Durham, you are welcome to come and join us at the Forest at Duke. You just come into the main entrance and then head straight. So you're welcome to come. You can bring a lunch, and we hope you enjoy it. I'm at Beth El Synagogue. Beth El Synagogue is a conservative synagogue. We also have an Orthodox minyan. We also have a bunch of other services. We try to have a very wide tent. We're at 1004 Watts Street, which is right next to Duke's East Campus in Trinity Park. And you're welcome to join us. Especially, we're there every Shabbat morning. We have lots of Friday night services, and we don't do tickets for the high holidays. So if you would like to come and join us for the high holidays, we throw our doors open and are happy to have you. So the topic for this morning, or for this afternoon, is I labeled it "Putting a King on Trial." If I did a subtitle, I might say conflicts between the judicial and the executive branches of government. I'm not going to go into all of the political ramifications that you might extract personally from this as it relates to the United States or Israel or other places around the world. I'll let you do that in the post-shiur, in the post-session, conversations in the parking lot, as it were. But for today, what we're going to do is look at the judicial branch and the executive branch as it manifests itself in the Torah and as it manifests itself in the rabbinic tradition, and see what happens, see what we can learn from that. I want to begin with a question, and for people on Zoom, I will repeat whatever it is that people offer up here in answers in the audience. But the question I want to begin with is, why were kings so useful? Okay. What do I mean by that? We need to understand as moderns that we live in an exceptional time in history. For most of history, and by the way, in many, many parts of the world, some of you know that a few years ago I went to Morocco and led a trip with the Jewish community to Morocco. And Morocco is ruled by a king. He is a benevolent king. He is well loved. But make no bones about it, and this is not the monarchy of, say, England, where the king is a figurehead. No, this is a real king with real power, who controls pretty much everything that happens in the country of Morocco. And this is the way that that leadership worked for much of history in much of the world. There were kings. And what I want to ask is, why were they so popular? Right? Why are kings useful as a method of governance? And I'm really asking this. I'm going to see if I can look at people on Zoom as well in case there are hands that are raised there. What are some responses? Bernie? Okay, so Bernie said, somebody once said the most efficient form of government is a benevolent dictatorship. Yeah, you don't have to deal with controversies as long as they're benevolent, right? Then it's very efficient. If you need to make a change, don't worry about getting bills passed and forming consensus and all this other nonsense. You know that a change needs to be made, you make it, okay? It's very, very efficient. You can change on a dime, you can make decisions, and things should work efficiently if you have a king, okay? Yes. And you know what? Everybody share their name, right? Thanks, Rose. So Rose said, historically, people were uneducated, they were not literate, and presumably the royalty had been educated. By the way, in Plato's Republic, part of what he recommends is in the Republic is the education of a ruling class. Okay. In other words, all of these people have to go to school. The idea is that if they are well educated, then they won't abuse the power that they are given. But ultimately, and ultimately, there may be some wisdom there because the masses, okay, according to this theory, can't be trusted to make good decisions because they're uneducated. Okay. And I'm not going to discuss specifics of the modern situation, but I will say that with regard to the internet, a lot of people thought that the internet was going to be an unadulterated blessing because you would have the democratization of knowledge. And a dark side of the internet that people are seeing is that instead of watching 30 minutes of Walter Cronkite or reading a newspaper, people get their information in 60 or 50 character tweets, in sound bites, in videos, and there is a susceptibility to manipulation of the masses that the internet is very prone to. So this idea of can we trust a group of uneducated people to make decisions, right? The monarchy was a solution to that because the assumption was that the king, or perhaps if we don't go as a pure monarchy, the ruling class was educated and could make good decisions. So Jeff said, monarchies are a way of unifying a diverse population under one ruler. Okay, if you need to, number one, get things done, but also if you want peace. A lot of times we think of peace as consensus, that everybody agrees with each other. Much more often, peace just means peace and quiet. Okay, it just means we agree not to kill each other because we perhaps we agree because we're more afraid of the king than we are of each other. Okay, so I think that when you have diverse populations, knowing, Judy, if you could take it outside or something, that would be great. So knowing that we have peace and quiet, right? Any other thoughts about kings? And now, by the way, I've asked you to give your best case scenario. What are the problems with kingship? Okay, what are the problems with monarchy, with consolidating that much power in one place? Okay, number one, you can't ensure benevolence. Okay, if anything, there may be a tide pulling away from benevolence, right? The idea that power corrupts. And even if you start out benevolent, there's a great challenge to whether and how it's going to continue that way. Richard? Excellent. So Richard said there is discontinuity. In other words, when you have all the power vested in one person, then everything depends upon that one person. And if the one person is either killed or the one person dies, then it leaves a vacuum, right, for what's going to happen. What's going to happen next? How is information, even if you don't see it as a struggle, as a power struggle, just continuity in terms of, do you know where the keys are, right? Do you know where are the keys for the kingdom? How does everything work? How do you create that sort of continuity? By the way, my brother studied English at the University of Maryland, and he got very interested in medieval literature. One of the things he taught me, so if it's not right, then please blame him, is that there were three weapons of the medieval king. The sword to conquer, the staff to lead, and the grail to pass on. And it was always the quest for the Holy Grail that you could never find, because figuring out how to appoint a successor, figuring out how to have continuity from one leader to the next is always the most difficult task. Okay, Michaela and then Judy. Great. So Michaela said, just as it was said, you cannot ensure benevolence, you also cannot ensure wisdom. All right, I mentioned that in Plato's Republic, the idea was that you could educate a leadership class to try to develop a school of leadership. And by the way, in the United States, you certainly have places like West Point, but also the Ivy Leagues were in some ways seen as places that would develop a leadership class. But you can't ensure wisdom among any person. There are plenty of people who are smart, but they are not wise. All right, and having wisdom when you get into that position is certainly not something assured. Judy? So Judy said that most monarchies are inherited monarchies, and that that may even make it more difficult to have wisdom in the monarch, because another element of this is that sometimes the book of Deuteronomy, which we're going to turn to in a moment, is very afraid of what happens when when the Jewish people go into the land of Israel. We get rich. Okay, we say, it was my hand and the greatness of my strength that got me all of this wealth. Well, when you're raised as the son of the king, part of being, you don't know challenge. And so raising for a son to raise, for a king to raise a son who's going to be able to inherit the kingdom and be wise and have the sort of fortitude that's necessary is actually maybe a structural flaw, right? It makes it even more difficult to develop a good leader when that leader is being raised within the kingdom. And it's one of the challenges that that many leaders try to overcome. So what we'll take one more, and then I'm going to turn us to our text. Tell us your name. Thank you, Dave. Great, thank you for that. That's a different perspective that I think is really important. When you are a monarch, a challenge to monarch is when you have all of that power, will people tell you the truth? You can be wise, you can be benevolent, but if you're ignorant of what's really happening, then you're not going to be able to do anything about it. And so power creates a challenge for people to give over information frankly and truthfully, right? So you've heard, there are positives to monarchies, there are challenges to monarchies. And what I want to do is to look at monarchy in the Torah, okay? And I pulled this up on the page. The verses that relate to the monarchy in the Torah are few, and we are actually reading them this week. So if you get really interested and you want to read these again, or hear them read from the Torah, find your local synagogue. But before we look at these verses, I want to put them into context. So first of all, we should understand this is the book of Deuteronomy. This is basically the first time in the 5 books of the Torah that the idea of a Jewish king is mentioned. There is one reference to a Jewish king in the book of Genesis that mentions sort of offhandedly that there were kings in the land of Israel. But, that's it. It's an offhanded reference. We should pay attention. There are places where we should expect a king to be part of the mix, okay? The book of Leviticus is a book of instructions for the priests. And there are verses that you can find in chapter 4 and a couple other places where it says, if somebody commits a sin or leads the people to commit a sin, and you need atonement on behalf of the people, it says, well, have the chieftain bring a sacrifice. Or it says, have a priest bring the sacrifice. And what it should say really is the king should bring a sacrifice on behalf of the people to atone for the people. But the king is absent from all of that legislation. There are other places, there are many, many places in the Torah that outline punishments, okay, especially in the book of Deuteronomy, but more largely, one of the things I work with B'nai Mitzvah students, and I have to tell them there are lots of things that are in the Torah that we don't do anymore. And we should be grateful for that, okay? Judaism is not the religion of the Torah, of the written Torah. Okay, that's a whole other lunch and learn that we can do another time. But modern Judaism understands there's the written Torah and the oral Torah. We have received traditions, and those traditions do away with things that are in the Bible. We don't take eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth literally. Tell our B'nai Mitzvah students that according to the book of Deuteronomy, if you have a stubborn and rebellious son, I also taught this to my own sons, then according to the book of Deuteronomy, that child should be put to death, okay? We don't do that anymore. All right. Nevertheless, just take that example, and that comes up in a couple of weeks. The people, even in that example, what do you do with the stubborn and rebellious son? You bring him to the gates of the city and present him to the elders. The elders. And presumably it's the elders who put the child to death, okay, who execute the punishment. There are lots of other punishments, somebody doing something on the Sabbath, right? And the king is absent from all of that legislation. Okay? In this week's Torah portion, it says, it begins, Shoftim v'shotrim titen b'sha'arecha, put Shoftim, judges. Shotrim seems to be magistrates, sort of officials of the court. They are the people who do the judging. Okay, the king in the Bible, in the book of Deuteronomy at least, is not the executor of judgment, of punishments, not the judge, is not the person who atones for the people. And in all of the places where you have Moses saying over and over and over again, obey, 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 there's no mitzvah in the Torah. There's nowhere where it ever says, obey the king, right? You're going to see it in this set of verses as well. We're never told to obey the king. So what is it that the king, okay? I'm going to read this out loud, even though I'm getting tired of hearing my own voice, because we don't have a microphone. Although maybe I'll do this. You know what? Sometimes I ask people on Zoom. Please forgive me. I'm gonna do the reading today. Okay. So let's listen to the book of Deuteronomy. Okay. It starts out verse 14. If after, and I can enlarge this a little bit, hold on, see if I can make it a little easier. Can you see well enough? Okay, all right, I'm gonna leave it then. And you also have it in front of you. If after you have entered the land that your God, Adonai, has assigned to you, and taken possession of it and settled it, you decide, I will set a king over me, as do all the nations about me. You shall be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by Adonai, your God. Okay, so what do you notice? Okay, so first of all, if there is a whole stream of machloket, of argument, okay? Jews love to argue, okay? This is our tradition. And there's a whole stream of argumentation in the Jewish tradition. Is it a mitzvah to have a king or not? And there are some, even though Judy says no, okay, there are a stream of commentators. Rabbi Yehuda in the Talmud, Maimonides will follow, and we'll see some of what Maimonides says about this. My teacher, the Kli Yakar, Rabbi, who those of you at Bethel, you've heard me mention him many times, Rabbi Ephraim of Lunchitz, who was the chief rabbi of Prague in the 1550s. They are of the opinion that it is a mitzvah to appoint a king, but Judy is in good standing. Abarbanel and Ibn Ezra and several others who follow them say, no, it's not a mitzvah to have a king. This is if you want to. By the way, what else tells you? Well, let me say one other thing. Do you know who Abarbanel was? Okay, Isaac Abarbanel was once one of the officers to King Ferdinand in the court of Spain. And you know what happened with King Ferdinand in the court of Spain in 1492 was the Spanish Inquisition. And Jews were expelled from Spain, where they had been for 1,500 years or more. The entire Jewish community of Spain was expelled from all of the Spanish Empire. By the way, that is how Jews got to America, right? Many people don't know. The first Jews to America, they were expelled from Spain in 1492. They settled in Recife, which was part of the Portuguese Empire in South America. And when the Portuguese had their Inquisition in the mid 1500s, they fled and they fled north. And it was those Jews who moved north, and some settled in Latin America and the Caribbean. Some of the oldest synagogues in the Western Hemisphere are in the Caribbean. But eventually the Jews who arrived to New Amsterdam in 1653 or so were Spanish Jews. They were Jews who came from Spain in 1492 after the Spanish Inquisition. Abarbanel left and he settled in Italy and then made his way to the land of Israel. It shouldn't surprise us that Abarbanel says, no, it's not a mitzvah to have a king, because what was his experience with the king? It was pretty bad, right? He saw the problems of kingship. But what else does this verse tell you? So it is an if, but suppose you do have a king. When does the king get appointed? Okay, so first of all, it does say at the end, one chosen by Adonai your God. Okay, so the sense is that the choice of king has to be by either God or God's representatives, right? We're going to talk about the priesthood later on. But according to this verse, when is the king appointed? Yeah. After you've entered the land and taken possession of it and settled it, which means that the king was not what? Was not the general, right? According to the Torah, the king is not a war hero. The king is not the general who helped you to capture the land. And we need to see the context of this. Many in the ancient Near East, ancient kings were understood to be either God. So Pharaoh essentially is understood to be a god, or understood to be God's representative on earth. And part of what helps them to establish their credibility as a king is that they are seen as essentially the creator king, right? They were what created the possibility of a king, of a kingdom. They created the kingdom, and therefore they should be the kingdom, right? They should be the leader of the kingdom. It is the idea that we wait to a point and that the king is not seen as. And by the way, just think of modern political leadership. Many of the prime ministers of the state of Israel have been previous generals. Yitzhak Rabin was a general. Bibi Netanyahu is actually the exception. Right? He leans a lot on the heroism of his brother Yoni, who died in Entebbe. But many of the leaders of Israel have been generals, and in the United States as well. Right? There often is sort of a question. You remember John Kerry, the big controversy came up about whether he was, about his service in Vietnam and what did he actually see action and all this thing. So this is not, I just want us to understand this is not just an old thing, right? And the fact that the Torah is saying, nope, it specifically is not going to be somebody who played who played that role, or if he did play that role, right, he wasn't the king at the time. We're going to separate those two things. Right? What else did it say? It says, you shall be, I will set a king over me, as do all the nations about me. What does that tell you? Was the Torah a big fan of the surrounding Canaanite nations? Okay, no. Right? When over and over and over again, when Moses is telling the people you're going to go into the land of Israel, over and over and over again, it says, don't imitate their practices, destroy all of their altars, the idolatry, the religion that they practice is awful. Don't imitate them. Don't do that. Don't marry with them. Don't imitate. Don't do any of those things. So when the Torah describes the impulse for a king as, I'm going to do it like everybody else around me has one, that's not a compliment, Okay, this is not seen as, oh, what a wonderful idea, right? Go along with what everybody else has to say. So it's a permission that is being granted, but it's not something that the Torah seems to have in mind. Judy? So the people, what Judy is recalling is in the book of Samuel, when the prophet Samuel, when they ask for a king, Samuel discourages and says, this is not a good idea. And Judy, to your point, the people like Abarbanel and Ibn Ezra and the stream of Jewish thinking that says that it is not a mitzvah to have a king, they raise the book of Samuel and use that to argue that the prophet seems to be against it. Okay, and that becomes one of the texts that's discussed. Right, and it's pretty clear that the book of Samuel probably knows the book of Deuteronomy. Yes, and thank you, Sherry. Yes, all right, so the argument, this is a set of instructions. If you do go down this path, then, and so now let's look at some of those instructions. So look at the next verses. Be sure to set as a king over yourself one of your own people. You must not set a foreigner over you, one who is not your king. By the way, very similar to the United States, you have to be a natural born citizen in order to run for president of the United States. Moreover, he shall not keep many horses or send people back to Egypt to add to his horses, since Adonai warned you, you shall not go back that way. What is the impact of telling the king that you can't have many horses? What are horses in the ancient world? So maybe wealth, but what else? For war, okay? This is limiting the power of the king, right? If you're saying you can't have too many horses, you're saying we're gonna let you be king, but we don't want you to become too powerful. Okay, so the Torah here is clipping the wings, all right? And the wings of the king are going to be clipped in a number of other ways, right? One of them is don't have a lot of horses. The next one is don't have many wives. He shall not have many wives. Now, the Torah gives a reason here, lest his heart go astray, okay? And I don't want to diminish the fact that the Torah gives a reason, right, which is that he's going to be distracted or won't be able to focus on things. But there is a more strategic reason why the king not having many wives is going to clip his wings. Can anybody? Not necessarily inheritance, influenced by others. So when you, Judy? So it might have to do with idol worship, but I'm thinking of something much more strategic, which is that if you want to form alliances, what you do is you marry your daughter to the prince of another country, and it makes it much harder to wage war on that country. And so the having many wives was, and the king could enter into an alliance by taking the wife from a foreign country. So this was limiting the ability of the king to do international diplomacy, right? To have many alliances, because that was a major tool. And nor shall he amass silver and gold to excess. So this is saying, don't have too many horses, don't do a lot of foreign policy, and don't We don't want you to, the way you get silver and gold is by taxing the kingdom, right? By taxing the subjects, and you need to limit the extent to which you do that. And here is the one thing that the king in the vision of the Torah is supposed to do, okay? So far we've had don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. What's the one mitzvah that the king is supposed to do? The king, when he is seated on his royal throne, he shall have a copy of this teaching written for him on a scroll by the Levitical priests. So, and it continues, let it remain with him and let him read it in it all his life, so that he may learn to revere his God Adonai, to observe faithfully every word of this teaching as well as these laws. Thus he will not act haughtily towards his fellows and or deviate from the instruction to the right or to the left, to the end that he and his descendants may reign long in the midst of Israel. What is the king in the Bible supposed to do? Follow the Constitution, okay? Okay, it's excellent. So one of the things, by the way, if he's reading this scroll, right, then repeatedly be reminded of the limits of his own power, follow the Constitution, and it says very explicitly, fear God, so that he may learn to revere Adonai, his God. He's supposed to be what we would call a yeshiva bocher, okay? He's supposed to be, in other words, the mitzvah of the king is to walk around with the text and of the Torah and read it all the time, okay? Be reading it all the time, always have it with him. He's supposed to be a student, right? So I just want to say, this is we should recognize this is a very strange image of a king. Okay? Instead of a king who is a warrior, instead of a king who is a judge, instead of a king who is engaged in foreign diplomacy, we have a king who's supposed to sit on his throne, supervise the writing of a Sefer Torah, and study. Okay, Michaela? And he's supposed to be modest, right? It says specifically, thus he will not act haughtily towards his fellows or deviate from the instruction. And by the way, so since you said that, I'm going to keep going a little bit in our packet. We're not going to read the next few pages all out loud, but I wanted to bring you some excerpts from Maimonides. So by the way, I just want to review the timeline here. So if we put the book of Deuteronomy, if we place it in the mind of the Torah or in the mind of the Bible as before the entrance of the Jewish people into the land of Israel, let's say it's in the 1300 BCE or so, right? I may be off by 100 years or so this way or that. Maimonides, so you have to go forward 1300 to 0 and forward another 1,000 years. Okay, so this is 2,300 years after the book of Deuteronomy understands itself. Maimonides is now codifying, right, how the Jewish tradition understands the rules of kingship. And what we find here is, I would say, a mixture of things. I put here the headline, honoring the king, okay? So there is a mitzvah to treat the king with great honor. We see here the king must be treated with great honor. We must implant awe and fear of him in the hearts of all men. Please forgive me all the Gentiles. The command, appoint a king, implies the obligation to be in awe of him. We may not ride on his horse, sit on his throne, use a scepter, wear his crown, use any of his utensils. And when he dies, they should all be burned before his bier. In other words, like, you know, nobody can use everything that he did again. We've got to make all new stuff for the new king. But we do all of that with a lot of honor. There's some stark images here when he is served the meal of comfort. Okay, so the idea is if the king has a relative die and people are bringing him meals of condolence, which is what happens in modern Judaism when we have a shiva. The tradition in Rabbinic Judaism is for the mourner to sit on a low stool or to sit on the ground. Here, the Maimonides says, well, the king should sit on sit on a low couch, but everybody else should sit on the ground, because there's something unseemly about having the king be lower than the rest of than all of his subjects. A king should cut his hair every day, have his hair cut. He should dress and adorn himself in attractive, impressive garments. And when he desires, the nation must present themselves before him. They should stand and prostrate themselves to the ground, right? So the king is to be honored, but listen to this. The king also must honor others. Now, who are the people that the king honors? I'm in the middle of the second page. However, a high priest need not come before the king unless he, the high priest, desires to do so. Whoa. Okay? If we're talking about checks and balances, if we're talking about the branches of government, what's envisioned here is that the high priest need not respond to the authority of the monarch. Okay, so this is not an all-powerful monarch, right? Now, by the way, what's the logic behind that? The logic behind all of these is, who does the high priest report to? God, okay? And God's name, one of God's names is the King of Kings. So if you're reporting to kings, you don't have to report to the king, okay? And so there is a sense of, right, the high priest is not subservient to the king. And listen to this, rather the king stands before the high priest, right? And they bring a verse to say it. Nevertheless, it's a mitzvah for the high priest to honor the king by having him seated and standing in his presence when he visits him. So it's sort of nice if the high priest goes to visit the king in the throne room, then the high priest should stay standing. It's a matter of kavod. But again, the high priest is choosing to do these things. The king should only stand before him when he consults the Urim and Turim. Those are the magic stones on the breastplate. And that's the sense of both of you need to stand because we're reading Torah now, right? In other words, that God is present, and so you're both going to stand. And there are a number of other ways in which the king is subservient. Look at the third one. He should stand before the Sanhedrin and the sages of Israel and seat them at his side. It is a mitzvah for the king to honor students of Torah when they enter his presence. So the idea here is that the king really must honor Torah, right? That's why he has to have a Sefer Torah with him all of the time. And the priests and the students of Torah and the sages and the Sanhedrin, they are all the representatives of Torah, and it's the king who works for them, not the other way, right? Errol, and then we'll take a couple of thoughts. It is, that's right. In the context of the ancient Near East, this king is not Pharaoh. He is not divine. He is not even sort of God's representative to the extent that he cannot be disobeyed, right? There's this balance of, we want to honor the king, okay, because it seems to be permitted to appoint a king. By the way, the Kli Yakar, who is he says it is a mitzvah to have the king, but the only purpose for having a king is that having a king, the king's purpose is to put the fear of God into the rest of the people, right? It's not to judge. It's not to do foreign policy. It's not any of these other things. It's actually to inspire reverence for God, right? It's the king as rabbi, right? Maybe with a few more accoutrements, right? They don't give me a crown, and I'm not asking. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right, so we had a close reading of the Torah, and all I want to tell you is you are now part of the Talmud. Okay? No, really. No, I want you to understand that the Talmud can seem like a mysterious document. What you just did is exactly what the Talmud is about. Wait a minute, I have a different understanding of that word. Does it mean this or does it not? I'm not going to resolve it for you. I'm just going to say you are in very good company, right? That's what the Talmud is doing. It's doing a close reading and trying to understand this. Judy, one more thought, and then I want to just look at the last part of Maimonides. You know what? I apologize to people on Zoom. I thought that I was sharing my screen the whole time, and I realized I wasn't. So I have now shared my screen. Can you see it now? And I apologize. Sarah, can you see the Zoom? Excellent. Okay. So I will keep it like this, and I apologize for going that long without having it. I'm just trying to multitask here. So there, part of what the Torah is, part of what Maimonides is trying to do is to fill in all of the how-to that's not included in the Torah. This is all we have. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20. Here are the instructions, go make a king, right? Well, there are a lot of things that come up in the meantime, and Maimonides is trying to fill that in. Now, Michaela, to your point, in the Mishnah Torah, he's also going to say, but wait a minute, the Torah verses talk about being humble, okay? And Maimonides, is giving some directions here. Just as the Torah, I'm at the bottom of I think the third page, just as bottom of the second page, the humble king, just as the Torah has granted him great honor and obligated everyone to revere him, so too has it commanded him to be lowly and empty at heart. Nor should he treat Israel with overbearing haughtiness, right? He should be gracious and merciful to the small and the great, involving himself in their good and welfare. He should protect the honor of even the humblest of men. When he speaks to the community, he should speak gently. And then towards the bottom, it says, the prophets have described the behavior of a shepherd. He shall pasture his flock like a shepherd. He shall gather the lambs with his arm and carry them in his bosom. This is the benevolence, okay? The king is not there to exercise power and authority. It's really to take care of, right? By the way, this is the Rosh Chodesh Elul, the first of Elul, the Hebrew month of Elul, which means that High Holidays is 1 month away. Sorry, I need to leave because I have to go write sermons, okay? It's 1 month until Rosh Hashanah. One of the key metaphors of Rosh Hashanah is kingship. We appoint God king. God is appointed king on high holidays, on Rosh Hashanah. It's a very off-putting metaphor, and I get that. But one thing we have to understand is, as I said, this was the predominant, part of the reason it's a difficult metaphor for us is that we are living at a time in history that's the exception, not the rule. Living in a democracy is, maybe 1% of every person who's ever lived has ever lived in a democracy like we have, okay? The primary way in which people experience governance was through kingship. And I think what the tradition has in mind here is the idea of a king not as just a scary authority figure, but really as a benevolent caretaker, as a shepherd, as someone who is pasturing the flock like the shepherd does. Yeah? Thank you, Lila. So who appoints the judges? It's a good question, right? So one thing which I will say, you can ask the question, who appoints the rabbi? Okay, because the Sanhedrin was essentially the makeup of the rabbis. Right? It was comprised of rabbis. Who made me a rabbi? There are a few answers to that. Number one, I studied in rabbinical school. And there is an organization of other rabbis who said, we think that you, having gone through this curriculum, we think that you know enough and are committed enough to the Jewish people and to the Jewish tradition to be a rabbi, right? But ultimately, you can be ordained as a rabbi, right? But you also have to do this thing called getting hired, right? And staying hired means that you need to, the community needs to accept your authority, right? So I think part of what I would say is who appointed the Sanhedrin, right? It was other members of the Sanhedrin, right? If I can tease a little bit, right, of the modern things, those of you who have been following the judicial reform issue, right, in Israel know that there is one of the platforms, one of the elements of the judicial reform is who comprises the committee that appoints the judges on the Supreme Court. Okay, it's a big question, right? In the United States, we have a judiciary committee that exercises great authority, and ultimately that has to be, the judges for the Supreme Court have to be appointed. There are other judges who are elected, but it's the question of who appoints the judges is a complicated one. One of them, one of the criteria is you have to pass qualifications, right? And so other judges, other rabbis scrutinize that. But the other one is that you have to find a community that will, that sees you that way, right? So now, right, but by the way, what's very clear in the Torah is that the king doesn't, right? And now we're going to turn, okay, I included some other stuff about the king and his Torah scroll or Torah scrolls. I'm not going to go over that. I want you to turn to the last page, okay? The last page is a story. And now in terms of our timeline, I want you to just understand, we went from, let's say, 1300 BCE. We fast forwarded 2,300 years to about the year 1000 of the Common Era. We're now backing up, let's call it 600 years or so in terms of the text, but probably another 300 or 400 years in terms of how the text understands itself. So this text is in the Talmud. The Talmud is redacted between the years 200 and 500, but it contains material that goes farther back or that understands itself going farther back, okay? There are a lot of issues there. I'm not going to go deeper than that, but just, you know, again, rewind, let's call it 500 years or so, okay? So this is a story from the Talmud, and this is what we're going to spend the rest of our time looking at. The rabbis told very, very good stories. They were excellent storytellers. By the way, let me just peek on Zoom and see if anybody, I have really been lecturing the whole time, but is there anybody on Zoom who's been dying to say something who wants to jump in before we go? Okay, remember to use the raise hand function, okay, and it will actually show me that you're trying to participate, that you want to say something. Okay, so we have a Mishnah, okay? Sorry, one more timeline. The Mishnah, let's call it 160 CE, okay? So, you know, a couple hundred years prior to the Talmud. And the Talmud is this document that's commenting on the Mishnah, okay? So the Mishnah in the year, let's call it 160 CE, reads as follows. The king does not judge, and others do not judge him. He does not testify, and others do not testify concerning him, okay? Now, that's the Talmud could go in a very different direction. Really? Like, why not? Maybe he should, right? Maybe the king should be a judge, or maybe the king should be judged. Maybe the king should testify, or maybe people should testify about it. That's not the direction the Talmud goes. The Talmud begins, and here it's called the Gemara. Everybody see number 1, where it says, the Gemara asks, okay? It asks, what is the reason that others do not judge the kings of Israel? Okay? In other words, this is the rule, and we're not going to try to change the rule. We just want to understand, Where did this rule come from, right? No putting kings on trial? Why not? Again, I leave it to you to draw all of the conclusions that you want to in terms of modern day. And I'm certainly not making an argument about anything modern day that needing to go this way. I want us to use this as a lens to understand the complexity of how we experience things. So what's the reason? Well, it's because of an incident that happened. Okay? Well, here's a story. This is why we don't do it. The slave of Yanai, the king, killed a person. Okay, so you have the slave of a king. Who is Yanai? Yanai is called in Josephus, he's called either Alexander or Janius. In Josephus and other Greek sources, he was a scion of the Hasmonean dynasty. Hasmonean dynasty is the period of Hanukkah, right? There was a short period when Jews did have some self-rule after the revolution at Hanukkah by the Hasmoneans, by Judah the Maccabee. And Yanai is the grandson of Shimon, and Shimon was the brother of Judah Maccabee. Okay, so it's a grandchild generation after Hanukkah. And the rabbis, by the way, they remember the Hasmoneans with great ambivalence. I'm going to read you what the scholar of Talmud, Jeffrey Rubenstein, wrote about this. He said, while Judah and his brethren were undoubtedly the heroes of Hanukkah, fighting for independence and purifying the temple, some of their descendants became kings and tyrants, usurped the high priesthood, and reportedly massacred the Pharisees. Okay, so the rabbis have, we'll call it ambivalence. So Yanai has a slave, and the slave killed someone. And Shimon ben Shetach, who is he's a rabbi, he says to the sages, put your eyes on him and let us judge him. So what is Shimon ben Shetach saying? What's he saying? Translated English to English. Fair trial. Okay, the king is not above the law. Okay, the king has a slave, and he committed a crime, and we need to judge the king. They sent word to Yanai, your slave killed a person, and Yanai sent the slave to them. Okay, so what was Yanai doing when he sends the slave? What's he saying? He's kind of submitting to the law. Why is he only kind of submitting to the law? Okay, so the question becomes, right? Now, well, let me read the next lines to sort of flesh out what the argument here. The sages, so the slave arrives, and the sages sent word to Yanai, you also come here. As the verse states with regard to an ox that gored a person to death. Okay, so there's a rule in the Torah that if you're an owner and you have an ox, he should be testified against with his owner. The Torah stated the owner of the ox should come and stand over his ox. So what does this mean? In the context of an ox, if your ox was warned, right? Hey, this ox is goring people, get a handle on it, and you, the owner, don't do anything about it, then who's responsible? You are, right? The owner. Okay. Now, and forgive it's an unfortunate and crass comparison, but here, what's the analogy? You, king, are responsible for your slave. Okay. Just as the owner of an ox is responsible for the actions of the ox. And by the way, you could even make a stronger argument. An ox, okay, it was warned a few times, but it's an animal, right? But the slave is a human being. Human beings make decisions. Now, but you can argue this two ways. One of them is you can say, I, the king, you, the king, you're responsible for your slave because your slave is not going to do anything that you don't tell it to do. But you could also say, Yanai could be right and say, look, my slave, is a human being. My slave sometimes does things that I don't tell him to do. I'm the king, but I'm not, in charge of everything. He should stand trial. But why are you asking me to come and stand trial for something that my slave did? Right? So you can see how it can actually go either way, right? Both have an argument, but say, no, you're responsible for your slave because we can't imagine that the slave ever did anything that you didn't tell him to. So you told him to kill the slave and to kill someone, and so you are liable and you're going to be put on trial. Okay? But what I do want us to notice is that that's a decision. Right? The sages are making a decision to rule that way as opposed to the other way. Okay? Yanai came and sat down. So you remember how I told you I read you all those things from Maimonides, who stands and who sits? Okay? So Yanai comes and sits down. Shimon ben Shetach said to him, Yanai the king, stand on your feet, and witnesses will testify against you. And it is not before us that you are standing to give us honor, but it is before the one who spoke and the world came into being that you are standing. As it is stated, then both the people between whom the controversy is shall stand before the Lord. And then that's what before the Lord, before the priests and the judges that shall be in those days. That's from the Torah. Okay, so what's the argument here? Right, so you're not honoring us, you're honoring God. But this courtroom, we are in charge. You're not in the throne room anymore. You're in our courtroom. We have summoned you to come here. And when you're here, we sit and you stand. Or both of us stand because we're both standing before God. But you don't get to say that you're the king, and so you stay seated while everybody else stands before you. Not in this room. Okay? Yanai said to the king, I will not stand when you alone say this to me, but according to what your colleagues say. Okay, so can you see Yanai in the courtroom? And what does he do? He says, I'm not going to stand for you, Shimon ben Shetach, but I'll do what your colleagues say. And then what the Talmud says is, he turned to his right. And the judges, it is implied, the judges forced their faces to the ground, right? In other words, they looked down. Okay? He turned to his left and they looked down. Shimon ben Shetach said to them, the judges, right, his friends, you're masters of thought, right? You're masters of your thoughts, meaning you're thinking, you're looking down, but you're not speaking up in this moment. You're not saying anything. May the master of thoughts, i.e. God, come and punish you. Immediately, the angel Gabriel came and struck those judges to the ground, and they died. At that moment, the sages said, a king does not judge others, and others do not judge him, and he does not testify, and others do not testify concerning him, due to the danger of the matter. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, so that's our story. I want to point out one ambivalence, one ambiguity in the story, and then I want to hear some thoughts and questions and commentary on what we just looked at. If you look at number 6 and 7, it says he turned to his right. There are two possibilities. What are the two possibilities of he? The king, okay, so one, if you're making a video of this, okay, the king turns to the judges and the judges look down, okay? And when the king turns to the judges, why do the judges look down at that moment? They don't want to look him in the eyes. Why don't they want to look him in the eyes? They wanted to disobey the king, but they were afraid, and so they looked down. Yes, they're intimidated. The king is using his kingship to intimidate the judges and say, really? You're going to, I'll stand if you want me to stand. Do you want me to stand? I got to hear, Shimon ben Shetach, let's hear from your friends, right? And he looks at them and he's intimidating them. And he's saying, good luck. Roll the dice. You want to mess with me? And you're going to have the kingship to deal with. Okay. What's the other possibility of he turned to the right? Shimon ben Shetach, right? You disagree, that's fine, okay? But it is the Talmud, what I will say is the Talmud is very carefully written, and here it's specifically written to be ambiguous, okay? It's here to offer up the possibility that Shimon ben Shetach turns to his friends and says, come on, guys, come on, help me out here, stand with me. And they're all cowards. And they say, Shimon ben Shetach, you're crazy, you're on your own. And here I want to say that can anybody offer up something on behalf of the sages? If it was Shimon ben Shetach and they're turning to him in this crucial moment, right? Why might the sages let down their leader, right? Besides, okay, they were scared. Is there any other reason why they wouldn't stand up along with Shimon ben Shetach? So what is the nature of the disagreement? You said they disagree with him. What do they disagree about? They are maybe making the argument that Shimon ben Shetach, you're being kind of a jerk. You're actually, when you say, you come here, okay, I want to point out to you again, Shimon ben Shetach had choices. He could have said that the king gives him a way out. No problem. Here's my slave. Judge my slave. The king is saying to him, you don't have to go to battle with me. I'm offering you a, what's it called? A compromise. Okay? I'm offering you something to save face. Okay? We don't need to provoke this crisis. Right? Take my slave. There's a very reasonable argument. Do I own my slave? Yes, but there's a difference between an ox and a human being and a human being. You can make the argument that slaves should also be held responsible for their actions. So judge him. Okay? Judge him. You don't have to judge me. But Shimon ben Shetach says, what? No. You'll come here. And then he gets into the courtroom, right? And he says, you can't sit, you got to stand. And you get the sense that Shimon is not interested in pure justice. What's he interested in? Authority and making a name for himself, right? He'd like to get in the news, right? As the lawyer who put the king on trial, okay? And so you can read this as the sages were just cowards that they weren't willing to stand up along with Shimon ben Shetach. But the sages may have just disagreed and said, you know what, we're not in your power trip with you, right? We think you're taking this too far. Yeah. All right, so the argument was for people on Zoom, you have to ask your question, if somebody else who owned a slave, would he have been treated the same way? right, or not. And I don't know that there's a conclusive that question, but I also, and you're right? If the answer is yes, he would have, another owner would have been held responsible, then they are saying that the king is above the law. And the story then is coming to point out that this is a dangerous path, right? That putting the king on trial is a dangerous path, and it's going to get people killed, right? Say more about precedent. So you're establishing a precedent that you can put future kings on trial, and then the question becomes: do you want to establish that precedent, or do you want to not establish that precedent? Right? The rabbis here seem to be saying you don't want to establish this precedent. Okay, I'm sure that I agree with them. Okay, that's a different question. Okay, but the story is pointing out what I find interesting about stories of the rabbis is they're not here to tell you, and therefore these are all the answers. What this story is doing is illustrating the what's at stake, right? The idea that there's a plague that comes down and it kills a whole bunch of sages. And it's illustrating what is at stake when you, if you do go down that path, right? It's not showing you what's at stake when you don't go down that path. But I think, those are things that we need to think about, right? Other reactions, questions, thoughts about the story, or about anything that we've talked about. Somebody pointed out it's 1:15. The truth is that in our usual lunch and learns, what I would do is we were on Zoom during the pandemic for so long, and I would have everybody say their names and do a little icebreaker, share their favorite thing. And I ended up only teaching for about an hour because the first half hour was the lunch and then the learn. So we've been learning for a long time. You've been very good yeshiva bachers. Any other questions or thoughts about anything that we've talked about today? I'm here in the room and on Zoom. Yeah. Thank you, Sherry. Well, so the question is, what is the meaning of the angel coming down and striking them to the ground? Like, what happens in that moment? Shimon ben Shetach says, okay, well, I clearly don't have the support, right? Because the people to whom I was turning are dead. And he also may conclude, I don't have God's support, right? An angel has come and struck down, has struck the sages down. I think I've gone down a wrong path. The king presumably walks out of the courtroom, and the sages are left, and the conclusion of the sages tell this whole story to say, don't do this again, right? So I think that's where we're left, right? I don't know that that's a happy ending, okay? But the rabbis are saying we live in a world where putting the king on trial, right? They have said it may be the Torah, wonderful idea, right? Wonderful idea. You can't have horses, you can't have wives, you have to, and then read Maimonides, you have to stand up when we walk in the room, the king responds to God, and we're God's representatives, and that's the check on power. And the Talmud says it's really nice idea for theory, but in practice, that ain't the way the world works, But maybe they're killed because they didn't commit one way or the other, right? They didn't commit to Shimon and Shetach, or if it was King Yanai who looked at them, right? They basically said, we get it, King. We don't think this is a good idea, right? Yeah, Molly. Take care, Molly. Okay, so ethical challenges of the story, right? Number one, hey, there are a whole bunch of other places in the Torah and in the rabbinic tradition where people are not judged differently by power or wealth. Again, you are entering the Talmud, right? That is what the Talmud does. It brings in other arguments and precedents and makes those things. The question that could be asked in return is, okay, but those are other people. Are there different rules for kings? Right? And should there be, right? And again, I'm not arguing that there should be. This is a descriptive, right, conversation. And I think you've asked a really good question on the story itself, which is the sages say a king is not judged, but a king also does not judge others. But what happens? Both of those have to be the truth, right? In other words, you can't have one without the other. So if you're living in a world where a king judges other people, then the king should be judged. That would be the argument, right? I think there's a lot to that. And, I don't think that this is saying, go murder people who you disagree with. I think that it is holding up the tensions between, and here I'm going to say more largely, I think it's holding up the tensions between the judicial and the executive branch. Look, I'm not a political scientist, but let me just throw on a hat for a moment, okay? The challenges of all governments is you need a government which is powerful enough so that it can actually do things on behalf of the people who it's governing, but that it doesn't have so much power that it ends up abusing the power and using the power against the people for whom it's supposed to be doing things. That's the challenge, okay? That's the challenge. And everybody figures out a way to solve that, right, in different ways. I told you, in the Plato's Republic, he says there's no problem with kings having ultimate power. The way we're going to deal with it is try to give them a good education to prevent the king from abusing that power. By the way, it doesn't work so well. Okay, I mean, it was a great theory for Plato, but it also doesn't work so well for Plato. The Torah has a different way of doing it, which is to say, give them a safer Torah, put some other limitations on it. Okay, democracies have different ways of dealing with it. The United States has a constitution, and we're a republic, and we have Congress, and we have the Senate, and we have the judiciary, right? We have all these checks and balances. And if you want to bring me back for another time, I'm not a total expert on this, but I think I've spent a long time in Israel this summer, and I can talk to you about Israel's challenge right now. It doesn't have a constitution, and it structurally does not have those guardrails, right, that the United States and that other democracies have. And that's, it's a big risk that not only Israel, but the United States, and I think the world is facing in these moments. So when I read about somebody being killed, part of this that I'm reading about is that the stakes are high, right? And guess what, guys? The stakes are high. They're very, very high when you get into questions about this. Let me take 4 final thoughts, and then I'm going to wrap up. Bernie, why don't you start, and then Errol, and then Richard, and then Sherry. Yeah, the Talmud as a methodology, again, the Mishnah has made a declaration in the year 160. The rabbis tell this story, right, for several hundred years later, and then we are now talking about it, right? The way that the Talmud is going to go about, the way the Jewish tradition is going to lean into is to discourse, right? We lean into to perhaps the wisdom that is found by debating and thinking about these questions, right? Errol. Yeah. Yes, Errol said the nice thing about dealing with the Talmud is you can't be wrong. Yes, that's why I deal with it, Errol, right? Mm-hmm. Excellent. So Errol made a wonderful literary reading, which is totally kosher. Okay. Good, good. Did everybody hear what he said? I'm going to repeat it for people on Zoom. No, and I'll repeat it. Okay. He said that notice the Shimon ben Shetach starts out by saying, put your eyes on Yanai, put your eyes on the king and let us judge him. Okay. And that, by the way, that is a strange way it's a strange phrase. And the storyteller is using it as a literary device because the rabbis in the end fail to put their eyes on him, right? So Shimon ben Shetach says, put your eyes on him and let's judge him. And it's precisely that failure to put their eyes on him, which means that they get killed, right? And so you're exactly right, right, to find the literary device that the Talmud is using, okay? Richard. Okay, great. So Ruth said, look, the Mishnah here has derived a pretty broad principle from this one case. And is that wise, right? In other words, in this case, maybe there's an argument to be made that you can't hold the king responsible for the actions of the slave because the slave is a human being and makes his own decisions and it's, he's not property. But what about all the other times when you want to judge a king, right? When the king has committed war crimes, when the king has done lots of other bad things, do you really want to not judge him? I can argue it both ways, as you might imagine, right? One of them would be, I agree with you, right? And so this is not wise at all. But the other argument is, no, this story is telling you that even though you might want to judge the king in those moments, it's dangerous business and you're not going to be able to do it. And there are going to be consequences that you can't foresee if you take this on, no matter what the crimes are, right? And I'm grateful to live in a world where we don't have a king, right? Where kings don't have that kind of power, and but I do think that there's something to listen to here, even though you've made a very good point, right? Which is maybe the rabbis are overreacting. The answer is maybe they are, maybe they're not. Right? Maybe there are real dangers to society, to the future of law. I mean, one of the images, Sherry, that we encounter here is you have a bunch of dead judges. It's a brutal, I mean, if you just think of it as an image, right? You have a bunch of dead judges that were killed by an angel from heaven, right? You're left with the image of, whew, right? This is not a happy ending. This is a danger, this is a bloodbath, right? And part of what you may be left with is maybe they're overreaching, but also maybe they're not. And my take on it is, even if you say no, you should put the king on trial, you better be very careful that you don't have somebody like Shimon ben Shetach in charge, right? In other words, Shimon ben Shetach, in this story, one of the ways of reading him is he's the power-hungry DA who wants to make a name for himself. And the very legitimacy of the entire enterprise is undermined by his eagerness or over-eagerness. Sherry. Right. So thank you. A whole other way of reading this is, even though the Mishnah doesn't go in that direction, the direction it could go in is when somebody says, set your eyes upon, right? Set your eyes upon, and then you won't be struck down, right? What was needed in this moment was for the judges to stand up and to assert their authority and to say, this cannot stand, right? It's a completely legitimate and other reading of the story to be critical of the judges, right? And like Errol said, I love the Talmud because you can't be wrong. To everybody, let me just look and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I am going to take a peek in my notes. And unless Donna can tell me faster than I can, what is our next date for a lunch and learn? It is Thursday, the 21st September. You know how much I love you because that is the date between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Okay, so the rabbi is going to be a little busy, but on the Thursday between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we will come back together in this spot. I encourage you to invite others. I've really enjoyed learning with you. Those of you who are on Zoom, thanks so much for joining. Mommy, I love you very much. And everybody else, have a nice day. Take care. Bye.